I remember stepping off the transport onto the cracked asphalt of that deserted installation. The fog hung so thick it felt like we were wading through damp cotton, and every breath carried the stale scent of old fuel and rusted metal. It was impossible to see more than a few steps ahead without squinting, and the haze gave every building and vehicle an ominous outline. I heard Sergeant Morrow mutter something about maintaining formation. Yet, despite his firm voice, I sensed the unease creeping into all of us. We had come in response to Bravo Unit's cryptic distress call, but already the emptiness of this place made me question whether we were too late. As we advanced, an eerie broadcast crackled over the handheld radio I clutched. The numbers, 37192, droned in a loop, like a broken record that refused to stop. Corporal West tried switching frequencies, hoping to reach command or maybe pick up a friendlier signal, but his efforts only yielded more static. Each time those numbers echoed through the radio, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. Though I had trained for missions in hostile territories, I never expected to find a base so unsettling, nor a call for help that repeated with no explanation. The main gates stood ajar, revealing a row of low-slung buildings with shattered windows. Bullet casings gleamed faintly on the ground, and a distant clang of metal against concrete rattled just beyond our sight. Through the haze, I thought I saw shapes moving inside the structures, but it might have been my mind playing tricks. The few times I tried to voice my concerns, Sergeant Morrow cut me off with a curt nod, telling me to stay focused. He had his reasons, I knew, but the silence thickened with every step, echoing the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong here. It was not just the fog or the ghostly broadcast that weighed on us. There was a shared guilt in our glances, like we feared we had arrived too late to save those who once held this base. Bravo Unit had always been our close counterpart, men and women we trusted on joint operations. Now, all that remained of them was a jumbled message over the airwaves and the lingering sense of a violent conflict that left no clear survivors. I caught Corporal West rubbing his temples, as though fighting off a headache brought on by dread. Sergeant Morrow tried to keep us moving as one, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders. There was little chatter among our team. In every training exercise, we had been drilled to check corners and watch each other's backs, yet this was different. Fog curled in around the corners of each building, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Each of us carried that worry in our own way, suspecting that if Bravo Unit had been overwhelmed, the same fate could be waiting for us. I held my rifle tight, scanning the distance for any sign of movement. The night felt endless, the surroundings warped by haze, and the numbers, 37192, kept ringing in our ears. We had only just begun, but I already felt that every path we took would force us closer to whatever had claimed Bravo Unit. My heart beat hard against my ribs, and in that moment I silently promised myself I would not turn away. We had a duty to discover the truth, and no matter how suffocating the gloom became, I intended to follow the trail that Bravo Unit left behind. I remember how we forced ourselves deeper into those lifeless corridors, stepping around more shattered glass than I had ever seen in a secure facility. Each door we passed looked as though it had been wrenched open in a hurry, splintering the frames and leaving twisted hinges behind. Our flashlights picked out dark stains on the floor, and I realized with a grimace that these were likely bloodied rags mixed with scattered ammunition. I tried not to think of the brutal violence it would take to cause such carnage, but every step reminded me of a struggle that left no survivors in sight. Corporal West's voice cracked the silence when he attempted to radio back to our command. The static was so thick that I thought the receiver might give out under the strain. As always, I heard the same broadcast behind the static, 37192, echoing like a sinister lullaby. Sergeant Morrow signaled for us to keep moving, his posture rigid with tension. I could sense the urgency pushing us forward, but I also felt the pressure of that unearthly transmission coiling around my thoughts. We found the command center down a narrow hallway, its entry blocked by a toppled desk and a half-shuttered steel gate. Once we clambered over the debris, we spotted flickering lights from half-functional consoles. The place was strewn with notes and old coffee mugs, as though Bravo Unit had abandoned it without warning. The moment I crossed that threshold, the overhead speakers crackled to life, parroting those same haunting numbers. It occurred to me then that the base's systems were still active, but controlled by something beyond our comprehension. Stepping carefully around the scattered papers, I noticed one log in particular resting under a broken monitor. The first few lines mentioned ongoing experiments, emergency protocols, and something about a quarantine. The words trailed off into a jagged tear, as though the page had been ripped in panic. My pulse quickened at the thought that Bravo Unit had encountered more than a simple mission. Sergeant Morrow and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that we needed answers fast. There was no telling what would happen if we lingered. Beyond the command center, we came upon a sealed door marked with hazard symbols. The lock mechanism had been forced, leaving the way open to a laboratory that immediately assaulted our senses. The odor was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and acrid chemicals. Lights flickered overhead, revealing a nightmarish scene. Shattered vials, toppled lab benches, and bodies in varying stages of decomposition. I spotted uniforms belonging to Bravo Unit, and I swallowed hard when I realized there was no sign of life among them. We found Commander Fowler's remains near a twisted metal cart. He had collapsed against a wall, one hand still clutching a small notepad. With trembling hands, I opened it and found hasty scribbles referencing those maddening numbers, 37192, and frantic words warning of an unknown threat overtaking the base. The final sentence trailed off mid-word, as though he had been seized by terror in his last moments. That solitary discovery struck at the heart of our mission. I glanced at the others, feeling a swell of dread, but also a grim determination to unravel the meaning behind Fowler's warning and ensure that his team's fate would not become ours. I remember how the weight of our discovery in the laboratory pressed on my chest, making every breath feel shallow and uneasy. Bravo Unit's mutilated remains had not only confirmed our worst fears, but they also sparked a new kind of terror within us. Doubt crept into my thoughts each time I replayed Commander Fowler's warning in my mind. Had we truly been too late, or was there something we might have done differently? The relentless repetition of 37192 echoed in my ears, and I could not push away the notion that we were being drawn deeper into the same fate. Sergeant Morrow kept us moving, but I sensed his own resolve wavering. The dread clung to each of us like a second skin. Corporal West's eyes darted at every slight movement and shadow, as though he expected something to leap out at any moment. Our training taught us to confront danger head-on, yet the fog swallowing the corridors and the silent emptiness around us fed a cold, creeping panic. I found my thoughts drifting to Bravo Unit more often than I liked, imagining their final moments trapped in this cursed place. Somewhere along our route toward the base's perimeter, I caught a flicker of movement in the haze. At first, I told myself it was only my nerves playing tricks, but then I saw it again. A shape that lacked defined edges and seemed to slither through the fog with unnatural grace. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I nearly missed Sergeant Morrow's hushed order to halt. I froze in place and strained my eyes, gripping my weapon until my knuckles ached. That was when I realized this figure was watching us just as surely as we were trying to locate it. A hush fell over our team as the shape floated into clearer view, though I still could not make out any distinct features. It was more of a living shadow, towering in the mist, and it seemed to look directly at me. My stomach lurched as the silent seconds stretched on. Then, abruptly, the broadcast crackled over Corporal West's radio again, blasting those same numbers. The figure turned, fading into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. We did not let out a breath until we were certain it was gone. Sergeant Morrow took control at once. He signaled for us to fan out, hoping to corner or confront the intruder. Even amid the tension, my mind latched onto a feeling that we were too exposed in the open. Just as we reached a cluster of broken concrete barriers, the figure re-emerged, closer this time. In unison, we raised our rifles, and muzzle flashes shattered the still air. Yet, it was like firing at a phantom. Our bullets found no purchase, and the swirling fog seemed to swallow them whole. I felt a stab of terror as the figure glided toward the far side of the lot without a sound, making my blood run colder than before. When it vanished once more, our squad regrouped, panting and shaken. An awful realization set in. We had no idea how to combat this threat, and it might have been studying us all along. My mind churned with guilt and fear, recalling the lab filled with Bravo units' remains. Were we marching toward the same end, lured by the broadcast we could not silence? Sergeant Morrow rallied us with a tight-lipped determination, but I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. We had found our adversary, or perhaps it had found us, and there would be no turning back from this confrontation. I remember how the chill in the air intensified the moment Sergeant Morrow called for a withdrawal. The prospect of fleeing went against every fiber of our training. Yet, after our last encounter with that shapeless figure, none of us voiced protest. My legs felt weighed down by dread as we retraced our steps through the fog-shrouded corridors. Every echo of 37192 over the radio seemed to quicken my pulse, reminding me of how little time we might have left. Corporal West led the way toward what we hoped was an exit point near the far end of the courtyard. The static on his handheld made it difficult to piece together any word from command, and those numbers echoed ever louder, as though they were following us. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my mind kept flashing to Bravo unit's remains and the scrawled warning we had found on Commander Fowler's notepad. That sense of guilt was a heavy burden, whispering that if we did not hurry, we would share their fate. We caught sight of the figure again just as we rounded a corner, its outline drifting between the swirling fog and the battered vehicles rusting in a nearby lot. Instinctively, we raised our weapons, yet our previous encounter taught us that bullets did little more than tear through the emptiness. This time, Sergeant Morrow hesitated before giving the order to fire. In that brief pause, the thing glided back into the haze, leaving behind a coiling sense of dread that made my stomach clench. To our relief, we discovered a partially collapsed fence along the perimeter that opened onto a weed-choked road. We slipped through the gap, hearts pounding as we glanced over our shoulders. The base loomed behind us in the fog, silent yet malevolent. A place that had already claimed an entire unit of good soldiers. The radio hissed, crackled, then repeated the same numbers, reminding us we were not truly free of the hold this place had over us. Once we emerged onto more solid ground, Sergeant Morrow tried again to reach command. The interference did not relent, but with some maneuvering, he managed to transmit our coordinates in halting bursts. Corporal West scanned the dense air with every step, convinced the figure might reappear at any moment. I wished I could tell him it was over, but a feeling in my gut insisted that our escape was only a temporary reprieve. We finally abandoned the base's immediate outskirts, yet none of us felt relief. Though we had fled with our lives, we carried a haunting debt to Bravo Unit and their unanswered call. 37192 remained lodged in my mind, a dark riddle that demanded to be solved. The echoes of that broadcast lingered long after the signal faded, and each of us silently vowed to unravel its meaning. We might have survived, but the horror was far from finished. We walked on, knowing we had only glimpsed the first ripples of a threat that could still claim us in the end.